And got it. Okay, excellent. Technical difficulties. All right. Hey, this week we're going to talk about the pulmonary system. And the next time I do a meeting, it'll be on a few of the respiratory illnesses. So we won't go into those today, but I'm sure somebody out there will have a question or two to ask about that. Okay, so let's start here at the start. So what drives our breathing? We're going to get to that. We're going to review a little bit of anatomy, physiology, a little bit about the upper and lower respiratory systems, and how we breathe. So what's part of the respiratory cycle, and what part does our nervous system play in breathing? Okay. Oh, can I just press advance? Oh, there we go. All right. So, all right. So there's a little bit of anatomy and some structures to the respiratory system. Disregard all the detail that's in the picture. Basically, main organs of the respiratory system are the lungs. And there are two sides, right and left. The right lung actually has 3 lobes, and the left lung does not have a 3, it has 2. Now, the reason why the right lobe has 3 lungs is slightly shorter and is a little bit larger as well and wider, is because it has to accommodate the liver right below it. So it doesn't show the other internal organs here, but the liver is on the right side and it's an awfully big organ. And so the right lung actually has to be a little bit shorter. Now on the left lung, it only has 2 lobes, but it's also stretched out a little bit and is a little bit narrower than the right lung. And that's to accommodate the heart, which the bulk of the heart lies toward the left side. So a little interesting food for thought there. So the trachea is a tube that entrains the air from the mouth and the nose to the pharynx, and then from there to the main bronchus. And from there, it subdivides kind of like a tree to the smallest units of the lungs called the alveoli. And actually, they call this lower area here your bronchial tree. You know, even though it's upside down, you can actually kind of envision this as a tree. And if you're wondering about the coloring, what's going on here is the red is in reference to oxygen-rich blood, and the blue is in reference to oxygen-poor blood. Okay. All right. Structures of the upper respiratory system. You have the oral and the nasal cavities. And in those cavities, air is able to become humidified, and the filtration process actually starts there. The air then passes over the oral and nasal pharynx. You can see that right here. You know, the nasal pharynx right above and the oral pharynx right below. And so as it passes down that tube, you have the laryngeal pharynx, and from there into the trachea. And just so you know, there is another tube that actually runs in front of that called the esophagus, and that goes into the stomach. So from the trachea, the air moves down all the way into this region here, where there's a bifurcation from, you have a slight bifurcation here on the right, and another one here on the left. And incidentally, when people aspirate, whether it's in the hospital or out, eating in a restaurant, 9 times out of 10, what you aspirate into the lungs in the way of food or something else ends up going into the right lung. And that's because it has a somewhat shorter distance to get there. And because of that, it usually gets entrained into there first before it has an opportunity to get into the left lung. So most of the time, if something needs to be pulled out of the lung by bronchoscopy, likely it's in the right lung. Okay, so we know that air moves past this into the right, into the left lung fields. Along the way, keep in mind that the air is constantly being moistened and is being filtered. Now, the filtration process is done in a couple of ways. We have tiny little cells or fibers called cilia. And all along the way through the air passage here, these areas here are full of cells that, that line the wall called cilia. And in between are the mucus producing cells that actually catch things like bacteria, foreign particles, you name it, it gets trapped there. So it doesn't make its way down all the way into the lungs, which would be bad business. And trapped meaning that if it's caught there, you can bring it up, basically. Coughing will bring that up. So at this point, any questions before I move to the lower respiratory system? Any questions out there? Okay, I'll keep going then. So we referred to some of this in the last slide, but the lower respiratory system, called the pulmonary tree, actually begins right here at the bifurcations for right and left main bronchus. So as the air continues to pass downward through these larger bronchial tubes, the tubes become smaller. And I want to say smaller as it goes deeper into the lungs themselves and reaches the little functional units here called alveoli, which is this thing right here. That's where gas exchange takes place. All right, so again, that's the destination of air as it flows through the tubes down into the functional units. And so O2 and CO2 are the two basic gases that get exchanged down here on the level of the alveoli. So what happens is that air that collects into those little sacs usually is richer or higher in concentration with oxygen than CO2. And in the bloodstream, the concentration of CO2 is typically higher than the concentration of oxygen until the little process of diffusion takes place. And the principle of diffusion is that whatever it is that has a higher concentration, it could be a gas, could be anything else, will tend to move into the area across a membrane where the lower concentration of the same gas or the same particles, et cetera, are located. So it makes sense that oxygen, since it has a higher concentration coming all the way down the tubes into the functional unit, will pass into the bloodstream more easily by the process of diffusion. And by the same process, CO2 makes its way out of the bloodstream and into these sacs to be expelled or exhaled. So hopefully that makes sense to you, what's going on when we talk about gas exchange. This is kind of on a basic level. I try not to get too technical, but somehow I couldn't avoid it. Okay, so this again is another, it's another picture of the organs of the respiratory system and the pathway. And in this sense, there's my little pointer here. No, so it takes the same descending pathway: nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, the bronchi, the lungs, and the alveoli. It's pretty amazing stuff. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Okay, so just a real brief on the structures. I want to say the lining outside and in between organs, say between the lungs and the diaphragm, or the lungs and the heart. We have these pleural linings, and actually there are pleural cavities, and it's protective linings. There is a pleural called there's a pleura, pardon me, called the visceral pleura, which actually lines the lungs. And then there's a space called called the pleural space. Sorry, I'm a little bit dry in the mouth. And inside this pleural space is actually fluid. And then there is the parietal pleura, which then makes contact with other structures outside, again, like the diaphragm and the heart. Now, in between is pleural fluid, and it's not a lot, but it's enough to, it's enough to protect the lungs and allow ease of expansion and contraction, basically. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Any questions? Are we okay? We're good? Okay, I'll keep moving then. Any questions in the audience, by the way? Any questions out there? Okay, if none, I'll keep going then. All right. So here's a little basic physiology, again, referring to gas exchange. And I want to include the heart because you can't talk about the lungs unless you talk about the heart also. And you can't talk about the heart unless you talk about the lungs. They need each other, and it's basically impossible one without the other. And that's because the heart delivers deoxygenated, or actually poorly oxygenated blood to the lungs, and that's from the right side of the heart. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any oxygen. It just means that it's not, it isn't oxygen-rich blood. On the other hand, when blood leaves the lungs, it enters the left the left atria, and then into the left ventricle, and then that is oxygen-rich blood because of the process of gas exchange. And so if you look at this sort of on the level of the micro vessels, the capillary bed, because this is where blood is flowing along and makes contact in the alveoli, and exchange occurs there. And so what happens once the oxygen poor blood comes through in the venous capillaries, the transfer is made, CO2 for O2, and it leaves with oxygen-rich blood through the arterial capillaries. And so that is the process in not too much detail because there's a lot more to be said about it, but this is how the heart is very active in this process. Actually, when you think about it, if you don't get oxygen-rich blood to the heart, the heart can't do its job. Yeah.
So basically, does this translate into like a cleansing process?
Yeah, in a way, the filtration of the air and picking up of debris starts up here in the mouth and actually continues as you go down into the trachea and the main bronchus, where you have those little tiny fibers. They're like itty bitty hairs, really. Yeah. Now they catch particles, real small particles and larger ones. And the mucus does the same thing because there's little cells in there that produce the mucus for that very purpose. And next week, I think, or the week after, I'll get into, what processes actually end up destroying those cells. Because of the destruction of those cells, you could wind up with other illnesses and pneumonia much more easily because you can't cough that up. You can't bring it up because it's not, you don't have those structures there or the mucus there any longer to trap debris. And so that's a big part of the filtration process. And then when you got down to the level of the alveoli, here is where exchange of the processes of metabolism, because CO2 is one of the products of that, and that's a waste product. Without getting into much detail, CO2, and I don't talk about very much about how CO2 can make your whole system acidotic, but it can if too much CO2 is left in the bloodstream and not blown off and relieved through this process here, where air exchange or gas exchange takes place. So that's also another thing I can talk to next time about the mechanism of there is a mechanism to control respiratory acidosis, and usually there's also an effect that goes on and through your kidneys to help counterbalance that. So I'll speak a little bit more to that next time. But yes, the process of oxygenation or I want to say unoxygenated and oxygenated blood making their way through the lungs and then out from there to the rest of the system by way of the heart. They serve each other and they need each other. And if one is not functioning well, the other one will take a major hit and it will not function well, and vice versa. So keep that in mind as well. All right, where's my little arrow? Here we go. So are we okay out there so far? Questions? Okay, I'll keep going. So what I just talked about, the gas exchange, you can see this on a particular level of one alveoli, a single alveoli, a single air sac. And you can see where you have air getting brought into the tiny sac. If I can find my pointer here. So air is brought down here. Okay, so the O2 from the air goes into the bloodstream and is caught up by the cells. The CO2 is actually brought in by diffusion, leaves the blood cells here, and then is blown out by the act of respiration, inhale and exhale. So this is just a real tiny exploded view of that. Now, again, the relationship, what do the heart and the lungs do for each other? You can kind of see where the arrows are going. You have the oxygen poor blood in blue, and then you have the oxygen rich blood in red. And this is the same picture I showed you, only the picture of the heart here is larger. So you can see what happens and where the arterial blood goes to the rest of the body because it needs oxygen in order to stay alive. And if we didn't have a process of taking the deoxygenated blood from the tissues, from as far up as the brain to as far down as the feet, if we didn't have a process for bringing that blood back, it would upset the whole equilibrium that's going on. So, okay, quickly, blood from the body moves to the right side of the heart. From the right side of the heart, it enters into the pulmonary artery. Pardon me, is there a question? Oh, somebody's not muted. Okay. So, all right. So from the right side of the heart, it goes through the pulmonary artery. I want to say the pulmonary artery, which is this one. Okay. So from the body, right side of the heart, pulmonary artery. Okay. So from there, the blood moves into the lungs. All right. And from the lungs, the reoxygenated blood comes back through Oh, shoot, I lost my pointer. It comes back through the left and the right pulmonary veins, right here and right here. And it enters right here, which is the right side of the heart. Okay. And you can see the pathway of the blood from the right side of the heart up into the aorta. And there's the ascending components as well as the descending components to the aorta. And that's basically how the system works. So amazing facts about the lungs. The one there in here that's in a picture form, you have 300,000 million capillaries in your entire vascular system. And if they were laid out, they would span 1,500 miles long. Now, yeah, that's kind of hard to visualize, but if you put all those into your body, you see just how long and how lengthy and how widespread blood vessels are throughout the entire body. Pretty cool. So by the same illustration, if you took your lungs and you open them out layer after layer after layer flat, they would fill an entire tennis court. They would fill an entire tennis court. So if you think of the tennis court and visualize how big that is, and you laid the entire lungs out on that, it would fill the entire court of a tennis court. So yeah, it's hard to kind of visualize that, but there's a way to peel back and lay flat what's going on in the lungs. And basically, it's gigantic in size, but here it is, it fits in our body. So again, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, plus, if you were to take your lungs out and put them in water, you'll find that lungs are actually pretty buoyant. They float. So that's something I didn't really think about or really know about, but they're actually very buoyant. Another aspect of the lungs, it's like maybe you log into Trivial Pursuit, or if you get asked someday, can you float lungs or can your lungs float? And the answer is yes. Okay, so not only do your lungs, not only do they bring in oxygen, but 70% of our waste is eliminated simply by exhaling. And that's usually water vapor and CO2 and some other byproducts of metabolism. And on average, per hour, we exhale somewhere in the ballpark of 17.5 milliliters of waste products just simply by exhaling, and that's per hour. And that's every day, every hour of every day, et cetera. So that's pretty significant. And then every minute you breathe in 13 pints of air, including whatever is in the air itself, pollutants, bacteria, molds, et cetera. So again, this is alluding again to the specialized mucus producing cells and the small hair-like projections that are in the respiratory system that help trap some of these particles and eventually to cough them back up. We don't think about that. We just simply cough it up and get rid of it. Okay. All right. Next slide. So, all right, how we breathe. Nobody thinks about it because it's an automatic process. So respiration, breathing has three processes. The first part is ventilation, and that's the movement of air between the outside atmosphere and into the lungs. And this is done in two phases: inspiration, moving air into, and expiration, moving air out of. Okay. There is a second process that involves exchange of gases within the body, and we talked a little bit about that already. There's the exchange of gases between the lungs and the bloodstream, and that's called internal respiration. The third process of of this air, internal respiration exchange, or the exchange of gases, occurs between the blood and the cells of the body itself. So that's yet another form, and that's deeper into the body, where the delivery of oxygen is necessary. So that is also another form of respiration. So movement of air in, exchange of gas at the level of the lungs, and then movement of the blood down to the other tissues of the body to exchange gases there. So that's a three-part process. So again, there are other structures involved with breathing. Probably the biggest main structure I would say involved is the diaphragm. And then there are also muscles that run between the ribs called intercostal muscles. And so both of those play a part. With inspiration, what happens is the diaphragm pushes down. It pushes down and forward over the internal organs below, your viscera, your intestines, and other organs that lay below the diaphragm itself. So what happens is the thoracic cavity increases in size. When you think about it, the ribs go out and your diaphragm goes down, and the intercostals actually help with that expansion of the rib cage up and out. And this movement allows a stretching of the lungs. And this movement also allows for the gases that come into the lungs to spread out over the entire lung fields. So it fills all the spaces, okay? So what happens here is this results in a decrease of gas pressure, which causes a vacuum. So when your lungs are actually expanding and the diaphragm goes down, it's creating a vacuum is what it does. And it does that automatically. It creates a vacuum and allows for air to come in through the mouth and the nose. And without that process, we couldn't do that. Okay. So with that pressure, the vacuum is created, and that helps to bring air into the lungs, or actually helps to suck air into the lungs. So this is part of it. So the process of expiration or breathing out is the opposite of the process of inspiration. Whereas the one process is active. When you're bringing air in, that's more of an active process of this of respiration. However, when you're breathing out, it's just sort of the opposite. It's more of a passive process. And what happens is another part of the intercostal muscles actually help to bring it back, contract it to its normal size and shape. And it helps decrease the size of the rib cage. And what happens too is that also relaxes pressure within the lungs. Excuse me, no, just the opposite. What then happens is all the structures, as they relax, pressure inside the lungs increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs and into the atmosphere. Okay, so this is part of the mechanics of breathing. And again, this part is mostly passive. So just think of it this way. It's an active process when you're bringing air in, and more of a passive process when you okay. So again, I'm going to refer to just quickly diffusion. Gases flow again from an area of higher concentration to that of a lower concentration. And so the pressure of oxygen I mentioned is in the alveoli is higher and allows for the diffusion of blood. And that's why oxygen can move from the lungs to the bloodstream. Same is applied for CO2. But atmospheric pressure, when we're breathing in, actually is slightly higher than the internal pressure within the body. And that's what allows for that process of bringing in air into the lungs and into our body in the first place. So the pressure just reverses. You have a higher pressure if with an internal pressure during the exhaling process, and pressure outside tends to be constant. And so the pressure builds up inside, and that's why the pressure gradient allows us to breathe out and exhale air, or CO2 and the other byproducts of metabolism. So this is a short video explaining some of that process. It's only a couple minutes long. So I'm going to go ahead and press it and get going.
What is the mechanism that allows breathing, and is it an active or passive process? First, we have to understand pressure. Outside the body, the air is 760 millimeters of mercury. At rest, the intrapulmonary pressure is also 760 millimeters of mercury. An important concept to remember when we talk about breathing is how gases always want to take the path of least resistance, moving from areas of high pressure into areas of low pressure. Breathing consists of two distinct phases: inspiration, inhalation, and expiration, exhalation. During inspiration, the intercostal muscles will contract and move outward. The diaphragm will contract and move downward. Notice how this increases the volume in the thoracic cavity and subsequently lowers the pressure inside. As a result of the larger volume, the intrapulmonary pressure has dropped within the lungs to 759 millimeters of mercury, causing air to be drawn in from the outside. Due to the contraction of the muscles, we call inspiration an active process. During expiration, the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm relax, causing a decrease in intrapulmonary volume. As the volume decreases, there's an increase in intrapulmonary pressure to 761 millimeters of mercury. We understand that air moves from a higher pressure to a lower pressure, and as a result, air is moved from the lungs out to the atmosphere. Due to the elastic recoil of the muscles relaxing, expiration is considered a passive process.
So basically, you just have to, you don't bother committing any of this to memory, but just understand that this is how the lungs work without us even thinking about it. Okay. All right. Let's move on. All right. So there are other processes that help control breathing or help regulate it, and that would be the brainstem, made up of pons, medulla, and midbrain. What happens there is that you have connections, you have nerves that help trigger contraction of muscles. Same thing with sensors within the heart, which means they can detect what concentrations of CO2 and O2 are like in the bloodstream. And if that by that way, increasing respiration or decreasing respiration, depending on the body's needs and by way of the concentration of CO2 and O2 in the blood. So let's see here. All right. It's an automatic process. Again, we don't think about it. We usually don't worry about it unless we swallow something down the wrong pipe. But again, this process is also where the heart and lungs are tied together, because nerve fibers go to the lungs and nerve fibers go to certain sensitive bodies within the aorta in order to detect O2 and CO2 concentrations and then adjust from there. So if you injure that part of the brain, you can imagine the consequences to automatic breathing and why they would be compromised, and why it might, jeopardize your life if that area is injured in some way, either by stroke or something else. It will change things drastically in how you breathe. All right, where's my pointer? Here we go. There is another mechanism, and this comes off the 10th cranial nerve called the vagus nerve. And this has somewhat of a voluntary control to it. It helps synchronize breathing and heartbeat. And by that synchronization, meaning you want to try to, it's a response to things like anxiety, fear, et cetera, things that tend to be have a sympathetic control or a sympathetic mechanism. What I mean sympathetic is sympathetic nervous system, where heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, blood pressure might go up. So the vagus nerve will actually work to reverse some of those things, to bring blood pressure and heart rate and respiratory rate down. So there's a synchronizing between the heartbeat and the breathing, and helps also in the delivery, proper delivery of oxygen to the rest of the body. This has the active, I want to say it's an active response, but the vagus nerve is also acts automatically. So there's a mixture. Again, this happens when the body is stressed out. And this is why things like yoga and other mindfulness techniques and breathing, meditation help to lower the respiratory rate and the pulse rate. And, I didn't even think about that much. And I've tried these processes before. And many of you probably have done so too. That's part of meditation and some of these other practices that we may use to help control things like anxiety. All right. So that's the end. I just want to recap a few things about the respiratory system. The respiratory system is made up of several structures within the body. It has an upper section and a lower section. And it does look like an upside down tree, because if you turn the lungs in the other direction, it looks like a tree. If you look outside your house, it looks like one of those trees. And it's analogous to that anyway. And that's why I've always looked at trees in fascination, because, the system of blood vessels within the lungs looks just like it. The functional unit is the alveoli. That's where the air goes into those small pockets and gas exchange occurs there. And so movement of CO2 occurs there out of the bloodstream and into the lungs to be blown off, and oxygen enters the bloodstream in order to be delivered to the rest of the body where it's needed badly. Respiration is a three-part process. You have inspiration, you have an external respiration, and then you have the internal respiration going on. So you have a three-part process there. So there is a brain and a nervous system component to this as well. Again, it involves the medulla, pons, and the midbrain, sometimes called the primitive brain. The vagus nerve plays a part in slowing things down as far as breathing and heart rate. And it has a component to it where it's partially voluntary, where you by your own will and decision, you decide to go ahead and try to just lower your breathing pattern. That's kind of hard to do if you've just run a couple of miles and you're gasping for air. But at the same time, if you're very anxious and you're right on the verge of a panic attack, you can regulate some of that, by voluntary control to bring that respiratory rate down and the heart rate down. So another thing, you don't need to really remember this, but it's like a Trivial Pursuit thing. The movement of gases depends on diffusion and the pressure of gases and that means the pressure of gases from a higher concentration to a lower concentration is how pressures and gases move. The path of least resistance, like the video offered. And that's really how gas exchange and how air moves into and out of the lungs. Okay. Any questions? It's an interesting process. I can think about so many ways that the function of the lungs can be altered by things that you do or things that we do, like going up to a high elevation, say 12 or 14,000 feet, and how that changes your needs for oxygen, or on the other hand, the fact that so many people still smoke, that has an impact too, a negative impact, no positive ones that I'm aware of, and how it also damages the tiny alveoli as well as the other structures that help to catch, things that we don't want to go down into our lungs. So to keep healthy breathing, you need to avoid things like any toxic fumes. When I used to work for the Department of Food and Agriculture, we used to do a lot of basic things underneath a fumigation hood, which would be constantly drawing the air out, so that we weren't constantly inhaling, nauseous chemicals like acetone, for instance. We'd be doing all of this under a hood. But, I often wonder of the 3 years I worked there, whether or not I caused any damage to my lungs or to other tissues by breathing some of those materials in. And if you go out on a smoky day, and since we've had fires here in California for the last 4 or 5 years that have been bad, imagine how that, causes things to happen in your own respiratory system, everything from scratchy throat to watery eyes to coughing, just simply by breathing the air in. So when kept healthy and undamaged, they're wonderful organs, and we need them. We need the lungs as much as we need the heart in order to live. So any other questions? Anything you'd like me to talk about when I come back with some of the illnesses of the lungs? Anything come to mind? Any worries or issues? Anything unclear? You're welcome. Okay, so all right. If no more questions, I'm just going to go ahead and stop share and go ahead and leave this particular presentation. All right. Well,
Thanks very much. Thanks,
yeah,
Rob.
you're
Appreciate it.
welcome. You're welcome. Again, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to focus on maybe 3 illnesses, disease processes within the lungs, because there are so many. No one couldn't cover them in a week or more. So, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. You all have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
You bet.